In London, Chinese porcelain was once described as the exotic flower. From the 17th to 18th century, it was very fashionable throughout Britain. Even today, a great deal of beautiful porcelain can be found here. Maurice Ham is 80 years old. He's been doing business in this street every weekend since 1967.
And I believe I'm the longest serving dealer here in the street. I was always very, very interested in Chinese art and porcelain. Chinese porcelain, and saw how beautiful it was and how wonderfully it was painted. The decoration, the colors were really quite wonderful.
London has become the most important centre for the study, purchase, collection and sale of porcelain outside China. The British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum have collections of around 20,000 items of porcelain, which attract over 9 million visitors every year.
They were quite amazed and mystified to some extent about the material.
Whiteness, its hardness, its translucency.
As a way of indicating the status, the wealth of the owner.
But nowhere has captured the world's imagination in terms of ceramics other than China.
In the early 16th century, Chinese porcelain was already precious in Europe. It was admired and valued in high society. To help protect it, it was decorated with metal ornamentation and was stored safely. It was only brought out for the most important guests attending the most lavish banquets.
We can see how it was decorated. There are engraved decorative patterns. Silver or gilded silver were applied onto the porcelain to signal and to highlight the rarity and beauty of these objects.
In the early 18th century, it was fashionable to order luxurious porcelain items from China. Owning exotic porcelain symbolized high social status. Some wealthy people spent their entire fortunes buying porcelain. The poet John Gay regarded porcelain as men's rival in love. He was jealous of the fact that porcelain was more attractive to women than men were. He wrote, "China's the passion of her soul, a cup, a plate, a dish, a bowl, can kindle wishes in her breast, inflame with joy or break her rest." As early as the 18th century, the East India Company had exclusivity when it came to importing porcelain from China. This picture shows bidders concentrating and waiting to see how high the price goes. Even the captain and crew who had brought the porcelain from China had to bid for the porcelain they'd ordered privately in China. The price of porcelain was almost equal to gold. From the 16th to 19th century, an average profit of 200% could be made by running ships carrying porcelain from China. In the 18th century, when the trade was at its peak, it's estimated that over 2 million items of porcelain were shipped to London. That's at a time when the population of England was less than 6 million. Huge profit drove merchants from all over Europe to China, regardless of the great distances and danger involved.
瓷器是一种语言，当你看到它的时候，就会被它吸引，觉得它是有生命力的。但是你不知道它是如何呈现出来的，很神奇。
我的理想就是去中国学习陶瓷。
300 years ago, Jingdezhen was the porcelain capital of the world. Visiting the city was the dream of many Westerners. And even today, in an age of modern transportation and easily accessible information, it's still a place full of puzzles. 35-year-old Derek is from America.
传统的文化，传统的做法，传统的原料，都还在景德镇。
做陶瓷的过程不是很简单，不是把一点点土拿出来就好了。这个过程需要可能一辈子的经验，我可能已经太晚了，其实。
Jingdezhen is still the spiritual center of the world's porcelain industry.
这个是高温的吗？高温的。这多少钱一个？15。
Since kaolinite was first discovered around 800 years ago, workers, craftsmen and merchants from far and wide have made their way here, settled down and lived by making porcelain. It's the only city in the world that has been producing porcelain for 1,000 years. In the 18th century, porcelain was produced here using a line process. 3,000 kilns were distributed throughout the town. The porcelain produced here was as white as jade, as bright as a mirror, and as thin as paper. At that time, this technique was known only to the Chinese, so orders from all over the world poured in non-stop. From 1722 to 1747, France imported over 3 million porcelain items from China. Denmark imported 10 million, and Britain 25 to 30 million. Europeans became obsessed with porcelain, resulting in huge inflows of money to China. Some contemporary scholars worried that buying so much from a foreign country would harm their own domestic economies. What's more, to Europeans, porcelain was a symbol of wealth and social status. Yet they didn't know how to make it. Being at the mercy of those who had this secret knowledge thousands of miles away was torture for those who loved porcelain.
Chinese porcelain was difficult to get hold of.
The thinness and fineness of the material, they just didn't know what it was.
If anyone had been able to make it in Europe, they would have done it.
They didn't know how it was made.
This seemingly ordinary dish is actually very significant. It marks the beginning of porcelain manufacturing in Europe. Today, there are fewer than 60 such dishes in the whole world.
It's technologically streets ahead of the pottery that was being made at that time. Quite a few have technical flaws. I mean, this one, you can see the glaze hasn't quite adhered evenly throughout and is slightly pulling apart.
This dish was made between 1575 and 1587 by Francesco I de' Medici, the Grand Duke of Tuscany. The House of Medici was very famous in Europe. As the richest family in Italy, it provided financial management services for various popes. It was also one of the most important sponsors in the history of European art. The Medicis had once sponsored Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. Francesco I helped with the experiments in person. Eventually, after 10 years, the research produced some results.
It looks a bit like porcelain, but it's not quite there. It's made from a completely different set of materials. This is made from clay, a surprisingly small amount of clay with ground glass.
In the middle of the 16th century, Italian craftsmen used white clay and crushed glass to imitate porcelain. But porcelain made like this was too fragile to last very long. In 1587, Francesco I passed away, and Europe was in the dark again when it came to the secrets of porcelain production. It was only 100 years later that large-scale experiments began again, this time in Delft, Holland.
This extraordinary piece was made at Delft in the Netherlands at the close of the 17th century. They would decorate grand halls and apartments. Tulips would be displayed in all the mouths on all the stages. The decoration is clearly inspired by Chinese porcelain.
In 1654, more and more porcelain started appearing in Holland. Its own porcelain industry was developing rapidly. The Dutch produced a great deal of blue and white porcelain, seen here, and soon had a firm hold on the European market. These pieces really do look like Jingdezhen porcelain. So, had the Dutch finally solved the mystery of porcelain making?
This is thin, hard and white. And that's porcelain. And porcelain was a technique that was well known in China, but not in Europe. It's more or less white, but this is earthenware. It has got chips all over. Here, there.
Strictly speaking, what the Dutch produced in the 17th century was pottery rather than porcelain. Take a cup as an example. At that time, European cups were weak. Sometimes the handle fell away from the body. Chinese porcelain was altogether stronger. It was also better from the point of view of color, durability, and detail. Before the 17th century, the art of porcelain making was beyond the abilities of European craftsmen. But they'd realized that the secret lay with the material itself and the formula for producing it. For 500 years, Chinese rulers tried their best to hide Jingdezhen from the outside world. But in 1698, a French priest called François-Xavier d'Entrecol arrived in the city on the pretext of preaching Christian doctrine. But in reality, he'd been sent to discover the secret of porcelain making. In 1712, he wrote a report that contained detailed information about the porcelain manufacturing process. The secret material that was required was also listed. Now, 300 years later, Derek from the United States has come for the same reason.
这是瓷石吗？
是。
我以前在这里买瓷石的，但是我从来没有进去。这个地方非常有意思。
This is a China stone mine. For over 1,000 years, the craftsmen of Jingdezhen had obtained material from this mine. As the basic material for porcelain making, China stone is the key to the quality of porcelain products. However, due to its chemical characteristics, it's impossible to make porcelain using this material on its own.
瓷石的温度比较低，你没办法把它，做出来一个形状，然后放在窑烧，它就会这样子。
Another material is necessary to make porcelain both white and bright. It was this material that puzzled the Europeans for so many centuries.
我们照的是一种比较白的原料，比较软的，不像瓷石那么硬一样。
The essential material is kaolinite, As early as the 13th century, Jingdezhen craftsmen mixed China stone and kaolinite to make white porcelain. It was a milestone in the history of porcelain. In 1712, Francois Xavier sent this secret back to France. But without samples, the French were still unable to make their own fine porcelain. However, 2 years before Xavier wrote his report, the Germans made a breakthrough. The city of Meissen is about 200 kilometers from Berlin. It was originally a military town, but is known today as the most famous porcelain manufacturing base in Germany. Porcelain produced here always attracts a high price. Even an ordinary plate costs around $250 US. It's traditional for German parents to give a set of Meissen porcelain items to their daughter as a wedding gift.
The story of Meissen is a story about passion for porcelain. And you know, King August the Strong, he was a global mind. He was passionate for the Asian, Chinese porcelain at the time, and he really motivated the researchers at the time to come up with a formula for porcelain.
Augustus II was well known for his enthusiasm for porcelain. He even exchanged his 4 teams of guards for 12 Chinese blue and white vases. He was desperate for Chinese porcelain and eager to know its secrets. At that time, the Dutch were making a great deal of money from their imitations of porcelain. The French had sent a priest to Jingdezhen to discover the secret of porcelain. As for the Germans, on the one hand, they had a flourishing culture and highly developed art scene, while on the other, they had the latest scientific technology. Would their efforts at porcelain production exceed those of Holland and France? Augustus II also wanted to know the answer. He spent a large amount of money setting up a laboratory to try to discover the true formula for making top-quality Chinese-style porcelain. Then, just as the laboratory neared completion, an alchemist by the name of Johann Friedrich Böttger turned up, claiming he could make Augustus's dream come true. Augustus II thought a lot of Böttger's talent for chemistry, but didn't care much for the man himself. So he threw him in prison and forced him to study porcelain making. Böttger analyzed and experimented in the hot, filthy prison until he finally worked out the formula for kaolinite. Finally, porcelain making in Europe was no longer just a dream.
Johann Friedrich Böttger managed to divine almost what the materials were, to locate the raw materials in Germany and establish what the processes for firing the ware were and how to glaze it and so on. It's a truly remarkable achievement.
These are early porcelain items made in Meissen. It's known as Böttger porcelain. It was the first time that Europeans could raise the temperature high enough to turn the clay into glass. This was unheard of at the time and kept Germany ahead of other European porcelain factories for almost 100 years. Augustus II wanted to keep what he'd discovered a secret. He rebranded Meissen from a military town into a porcelain base. He also forced Böttger to remain there for another 13 years until the alchemist's death at the age of 37. Böttger was certainly the inventor of European porcelain, but was also its prisoner. This pipe organ is notable for its audio conduction system, which is made entirely of porcelain. It was Augustus II's idea. He not only wanted to look at porcelain and feel it, he also wanted to hear it. He ordered this instrument in 1732, but it was only completed in 2003. Augustus II eventually sealed up the biggest secrets of German porcelain making. From 1710, when the Meissen factory was built, until today, more than 700,000 molds have been made and stored in the warehouse. Even today, the formula of the factory's kaolinite is still regarded as a commercial secret.
如果我想用这个瓷石来做瓷涂，它必须有一个很高温的一个很硬的东西可以一起挑的，那个就是高冷土。所以高冷土跟瓷石放一起，就可以做出来一种很白、很透明的一种瓷。
The key to porcelain making is its component materials, kaolinite and China stone. With the addition of kaolinite, China stone can endure high temperatures. But it took Europeans almost 300 years to discover this secret. The Chinese people have been making porcelain since the late 6th century. It's been used for ornaments and items in daily use. In the 16th century, while the whole of Europe was busy experimenting into porcelain secrets, the Chinese turned their attention to the finer points of porcelain. This is a book written in the 16th century. It's the equivalent of today's consumer handbook. The writer outlines the rituals and taboos of porcelain use. For example, good porcelain shouldn't be used in the wrong way or at the wrong time. Teacups should fit properly into the hand. If they're too big, they're not elegant. More than 2 flowers will turn a room into a frivolous tavern. To strictly follow all the rules in the book, one had to be both wealthy and well-educated. At that time, this book was admired by a great number of scholars. But Europeans had no idea of the etiquette of porcelain. Most of them didn't even have plates or bowls of any kind, let alone exquisite porcelain ones. Most used slices of stale bread as plates. Before the 14th century, spoons, cups and plates were very rare in Europe, and cups were shared. It was only at the dawn of the 17th century, as porcelain and tea became popular, that the European diet and aesthetic tastes finally changed. Located in suburban London, Ham House epitomizes the noble style of the 17th century.
This is Ham House. It was built in 1610 and is typical of the type of houses that were being built for courtiers of James I. His eldest daughter, Elizabeth, then inherited the house.
In the early 17th century, European nobles would set up a room especially for drinking tea, if only to show their high social status.
This tiny little private room, which is called a closet, and we know that Elizabeth enjoyed drinking tea in this room. Tea drinking in England was a very new fad at this point, but Elizabeth was one of the early taker-uppers of this habit.
Tea drinking was quietly changing the lifestyles of European people. This clip is how the Victoria and Albert Museum demonstrates tea drinking in Britain. In the early 17th century, when tea had just been introduced to Britain, it was widely believed that tea could cure all illnesses, so it was extremely expensive. Treating people to tea was a new way to show off one's wealth. In the latter half of the 17th century, the drinking of tea completely changed wealthy people's ideas about consumption and social integration. This resulted in a higher regard for both food and drink, and how it was served. These new attitudes emanated out from the royal court into the homes of ordinary people. The fashion spread fast and endured. Even after the 1730s, ordinary families would spend 10% of their annual income on tea. In these circumstances, chinaware, which could set off the tea's colour and fragrance, became a must-have item. As long as the porcelain tea set had Chinese characteristics, it would make people feel special and culturally linked with what they perceived to be an exotic Chinese lifestyle. The Chinese often create pictorial designs that tell household stories. This one, for instance, is an attempt to describe how a poor scholar and a girl from a wealthy family fall for each other, in spite of their different social backgrounds. With a little help from the maid, the two are eventually able to tie the knot. This is a blue and white porcelain vase made during Emperor Kangxi's reign in the 17th century. The romance of the West Chamber is illustrated through the decorations.
It is a very important and significant piece because it is decorated on the surface with illustrations taken from the very popular love story and novel CC&G, European clients, who were unable to read the illustrations and to understand their sources. But still it had an appeal to Europeans. It had a very strong, appealing and we can say exotic flavor. And this was the reason why they were so eagerly collected and sought after.
The 24 pictures tell the complete story of the romance of the West Chamber. But at that time, Europeans had no idea what the story was about. But they were able to see the elegance of Chinese people from these pictures. The implicit style of this Chinese love story and the gentleness of Chinese women aroused their interest in what they thought of as the mysterious and colourful Oriental culture. This European obsession with Chinese style led manufacturers to imitate the style and images of Chinese porcelain. This is a porcelain dish made by Delft's craftsmen in the 18th century. It also shows scenes from Romance of the West Chamber, but the male character has been transformed into a chubby man with a European nose.
Europeans were fascinated by the Chinese figures they saw on imported lacquer and china. During the 17th century, when Europeans became widely familiar with Chinese porcelain and lacquer, they became fascinated with the figures that decorated these pieces.
Europeans liked to link themselves to the Chinese style in their imaginations. In their opinion, Chinese people were amiable and always enjoyed themselves. The Chinese had a harmonious relationship with nature and asked for little. Everyone wanted to know more about this exotic fairyland. For about 2,000 years, Guangzhou has been an important port for foreign commerce. After the ban on maritime trade was lifted in 1684, Guangzhou became the only foreign trade port in China, and most Chinese porcelain was exported from here. This is a Punchbowl. It was ordered in China by the crew of a British ship in the 18th century. The bowl includes a lifelike depiction of Guangzhou's 13 factories. The Chinese government had ruled that all foreign merchants should trade through middlemen authorized by the government. These middlemen operated out of premises called 13 factories. Of all the factories, European merchants visited those that dealt in porcelain most often. As Guangzhou merchants traded with foreign merchants, Chinese craftsmen created a unique porcelain style called Canton porcelain.
咁我哋就係一種中國嘅文化同外國文化一個結合嘅一個產物。
In the 300-year period up to the 20th century, a huge number of Canton porcelain items were sold all over the world. A craze for it swept across Europe. In the 18th and 19th century, sales of this type of porcelain even surpassed those of blue and white porcelain and famille rose porcelain.
因為廣彩主要咧就係對外銷售，咁外國人嘅喜好開始嘅時候咧，對廣彩嘅認識係感覺到佢即係覺得好滿到自己感覺得有啲唔喜歡嘅。
In contrast to Chinese porcelain's quiet appearance, this type of porcelain was more colourful and brilliant. Western people wanted more vivid colours. As a result, porcelain with a white background and painted patterns became popular. A sailor from the East India Company described the painted porcelain business like this. In a long hall, about 200 people are busy painting patterns on porcelain and adding other decoration. There are old workers as well as children aged about 6 or 7. It's obvious that by this time, Canton porcelain production had become an industry. Because of its luxurious and brilliant style, Canton porcelain was a hit across Europe. It not only agreed with European tastes, but also fitted in with the Rococo style, which was popular in European royal palaces.
Oui, passionné d'une famille de 3 générations à fabriquer et distribuer la porcelaine de Limoges. Oui. Pour en faire aujourd'hui vraiment une porcelaine unique où vous pouvez apporter toujours une technique en plus à la pièce. Et personnellement, c'est un petit peu de parti pris, mais je pense que c'est ce qui en fait vraiment la spécificité à Limoges, difficilement égalable.
Limoges, French porcelain capital. The city is full of porcelain. Every factory sparkles with its own understanding and unique take on the porcelain art. Creativity runs through the city from one end to the other. porcelain items enrich people's tables, living rooms and bedrooms.
Façon de travailler, du goût, des couleurs, des décors, des habillages, des pièces de forme. C'est vraiment Limoges a su retransmettre ce savoir, cette spécificité française. C'est vraiment ce qui a fait la force de Limoges.
From 1759 to 1842, Guangzhou was the only port connecting China with the world. After hundreds of years of development, the porcelain export market gradually improved. The East India Company, supported by the British government, became China's #1 trading partner. London, Jingdezhen and Guangzhou formed a triangular relationship in the porcelain trading chain. This plate was made in Britain in 1758. The Chinese man in the pattern seems puzzled by a blue and white porcelain vase with the word Bow on it. In fact, the word refers to the Bow porcelain factory in London. In this humorous way, British people expressed their ambition to compete with Chinese porcelain. At the time of the Industrial Revolution, British manufacturers used the steam engine in the porcelain industry, giving them a competitive edge over other porcelain makers in Europe.
Stoke-on-Trent was the centre of the British pottery industry, and so was equivalent if in China to Jingdezhen. These huge bottle ovens dominated the landscape. There were over 5,000 of them 100 years ago.
The British factories reacted to market demands, producing goods to meet specific local needs.
Other pottery companies made items for washing and keeping clean, but in Stoke-on-Trent they also developed a whole new industry. They developed the ceramic water closet, the first one-piece all-ceramic sit-on-honourable toilet.
Being in tune with the Western lifestyle and aesthetics made the British porcelain industry more competitive.
It's actually a soup tureen for serving soup, and it was made in Chelsea, in London, in the 1750s. This is an incredibly ambitious production to make in a soft paste porcelain.
Owning a bowl like this would make the hostess proud. This type of westernized porcelain even influenced the porcelain makers of Jingdezhen in China. This bowl was made in Jingdezhen. There are many more similar examples of Chinese craftsmen imitating European porcelain styles. In the late 18th century, to protect its home-produced porcelain, some European countries raised the tariff on imported Chinese porcelain. It became harder for Chinese porcelain manufacturers to make a profit, while the European porcelain industry became more and more mature and creative. Finally, the Europeans severed the link with China. In 1791, the East India Company stopped importing porcelain from China for good. More than 300 years has passed since those times, but communication between Chinese and other cultures, which was initiated by porcelain trading, has never stopped. Porcelain experts and enthusiasts from all over the world still gather in Jingdezhen to learn the ancient secrets of the porcelain-making art. The world of porcelain is a harmonious place, closely connected to nature, in the same way that this remarkable, bright, white substance is itself both a creation of the earth and of human ingenuity across the ages.